I used to think wars started with shouting sirens, maybe somebody throwing a punch in the middle of the street. Turns out one of the ugliest battles I've ever been in started with cedar panels, stone columns, and a man smiling like he'd just improved the neighborhood. By the time I understood what was really happening, 4 feet of my land had almost disappeared behind a beautiful fence I never asked for. I live just outside a small town in western Pennsylvania, the kind of place where people still lift 2 fingers off the steering wheel when they pass you, where everybody knows whose dog keeps getting loose, and where property lines are usually treated like old promises. Quiet, understood, not something you argue over unless you absolutely have to. My place isn't fancy. It's a modest house with a detached workshop out back, and that workshop is probably where I spend more time than I should. Some men golf, some fish. I stand around pretending I'm going to finish furniture projects and fixing tools older than I am. That's my version of peace. For years, the lot next to mine just sat there doing nothing. It had a sagging shed brush up to your waist, a few rusted posts leaning like they were tired of standing, and no sign anybody cared enough to touch it. I got used to it. It was just part of the view, one of those empty spaces you stop seeing because it's always been there. Then one summer a for sale sign went up, and by August it was gone. A week later a black pickup rolled in, followed by 2 SUVs, and that's how I met Daniel Mercer. Daniel was younger than me, maybe late 30s, polished in a way that felt a little unusual for our patch of Pennsylvania. Even on a hot day he looked put together, sunglasses on, shirt crisp, the kind of guy who seemed like he had plans for everything before he even stepped out of the truck. He walked across the grass like the place already belonged to him and stuck out his hand. "Daniel," he said, "just closed on the lot." I told him my name was Evan, said I'd been next door about 15 years, and he smiled while looking around like he could already see something the rest of us couldn't. "Got some big ideas for this place," he said. "Gonna clean it up, build something nice." And honestly, I was glad to hear it. I wasn't one of those neighbors who gets personally offended by progress. The lot had been neglected forever. If he wanted to make it look better, good for him. Maybe it'd even lift the whole stretch a little. Maybe it'd make the road feel less forgotten. I meant it when I wished him luck. Then the machinery started showing up. At first it was normal enough, brush clearing, hauling junk, grading the ground. Loud, sure, but not crazy. Then it escalated. Excavators, flatbeds stacked with stone pallets of lumber, steel hardware crews coming in, early engines firing up before I'd finished my first cup of coffee. What used to be birds and wind through the trees turned into backup alarms and the clank of metal all day long. It didn't exactly bother me, but it did start to feel like Daniel wasn't just building a house. He was making a statement. Then came the fence. Now, when somebody says they're putting up a fence around here, you picture something simple. Wood panels, maybe 6 feet tall. Maybe a gate if they've got dogs. Functional. Ordinary. This thing was not ordinary. They dug deep holes every 10 or 12 feet and poured concrete like they were setting foundations for a fortress. Then they installed these massive stone columns, perfectly cut, neatly stacked, sealed so tight they looked like they belonged at the entrance to some gated estate where people complain about caviar being warm. A few days later, the cedar panels went in, thick, dark, expensive-looking, glowing in the afternoon sun like they'd been polished by hand. Black iron brackets tied everything together, and suddenly it wasn't a fence anymore. It was a message. Privacy. Control. Money. It said, "This is mine. This is permanent. This is not up for discussion." And the more of it that went up, the more something in me started to itch. Not because it was ugly. It actually looked great, which almost made it worse. It looked too right to be wrong. But every time I stood in my yard and looked toward the workshop, the fence felt closer than it should have been. Not crooked, not leaning, not sloppy, just wrong. Like the whole thing had drifted a little too far in my direction. I kept telling myself it was the height making the space feel tighter. Perspective. Optical illusion. End of summer brain. You know how you try to talk yourself out of a bad feeling because the alternative is trouble? A couple nights later, I mentioned it to my buddy Carl over beers. He squinted toward the line, took a sip, and said, "Looks expensive." "Yeah," I said. "That's not what I mean." He grinned. "You think he built it on your land?" The problem was by then I already had. Once that thought got in my head, it would not leave. So that night, I went into my office, dug through an old drawer stuffed with closing papers, tax records, junk I hadn't looked at in years, and found the original survey from when I bought the place. folded inside a beat-up manila folder, yellowed at the edges, but still readable. I spread it out on the desk and started tracing lines with my finger like I was reading some kind of warning too late. There it was, the boundary, the angles, the measurements, the reference points, and the note about old metal pins marking the corners. According to that survey, my property extended several feet farther than where Daniel's grand masterpiece now stood. Not inches. Feet. That's when the feeling changed. Up to that moment, it had just been unease. After that, it became weight. Because if that survey was right, then this wasn't about style or noise or whether Daniel had a tendency to overdo things. This was about ownership. About something that was mine legally, mine slowly being absorbed into someone else's vision because nobody had stopped to check. The next morning, I called a surveyor named Rick Dalton. Yeah, I made the movie joke. No, he didn't laugh. He sounded like the kind of man who had spent decades settling arguments nobody wanted to be having. Calm, dry, precise. When I explained the situation, he said, "If the original pins are still there, we'll know exactly where your line is." Exactly. That word stayed with me all week. Rick came out Friday morning, cool air, pale sunlight, one of those quiet late summer days where everything feels sharper than usual. He pulled up in an older white truck with equipment stacked neatly in the back and got to work without wasting a sentence. He moved slow and methodical, setting up the tripod, looking through the scope, jotting notes, walking the perimeter like he was reconstructing an invisible truth 1 inch at a time. Watching him was oddly calming, like somebody was peeling emotion off the situation and replacing it with facts. Then he crouched near the edge of my yard, scraped away some dirt with his boot, and tapped metal. "Got one," he said. It was a rusted pin, barely visible, buried just enough that no normal person would ever notice it. We found 2 more over the next hour, each one lined up with the old survey. Each one tightened the knot in my stomach a little more. By early afternoon, Rick stood looking down the fence line with his clipboard tucked against his side and asked, "You want the short version or the detailed one?" I said, "Short." He nodded toward the fence. "It's on your property. Deepest point about 4 feet. 4 feet? That doesn't sound like much until you see 4 feet stretch the full length of a luxury fence built in stone and cedar. Then it feels like a theft performed with receipts and landscaping." Rick handed me the report, emailed me a digital copy, then pulled out bright orange flags and started placing them along the actual boundary. One by one, those little flags turned suspicion into something solid. By the time he finished, the entire fence sat visibly, undeniably on my side. Not close, not arguable. Wrong. He packed up, nodded once, and said, "If this goes to court, that report'll hold." I stood there after he left, just staring. The fence looked the same as it had the day before. Same stone, same wood, same smug, expensive silence. But now I knew what I was looking at, and somehow that changed everything. Daniel noticed the flags 2 days later. It was Sunday afternoon. I was in the workshop, sanding a slab of old oak, trying to lose myself in something simple, when I heard footsteps on the gravel. He walked over wearing those same sunglasses, hands in his pockets, casual on the surface but not relaxed. "What's with the flags?" he asked. I shut off the sander, wiped my hands, and told him I'd had a survey done. I handed him the report. He read fast at first, then slower. His face barely moved, but I saw it happen, that tiny shift when confidence starts cracking. He looked at the fence, then the flags, then back at the paper. "That doesn't make sense," he said. "It does if your contractor used the wrong marker," I told him. Turns out they'd based the whole build on an old wooden stake they found near the brush line. Not an official survey marker, just some random piece of wood stuck in the ground who knows when. Real boundary pins are metal. Permanent, legal. Buried, yes, but still there if you know what you're looking for. I pointed toward one of the flagged corners. "Line runs there," I said. "Not here." The wind moved through the trees. Cedar creaked softly. Somewhere down the road a dog started barking, and right there in all that ordinary sound, the whole thing shifted from neighborly misunderstanding to open conflict. "So what are you saying?" he asked. I looked him straight in the eye. "I'm saying your fence is on my land." He gave a little laugh, but there wasn't any humor in it. Then came the part I'd been expecting: the math, the cost, the disbelief, weeks of work, stone columns, custom panels, money sunk into the ground. Finally, he said the question out loud. "You want me to tear it all down?" Legally, I said that's one option. He stared at me like I'd just suggested burning his house down for fun. Then he went quiet, said he needed to talk to his contractor, and walked off with the report in his hand. For a few days, everything went still in that tense, loaded way. that isn't peace at all. I stayed busy in the workshop, reorganized tools that did not need reorganizing, started projects I had no intention of finishing. Because once you know somebody crossed a line, even by mistake, it changes the air between you. You stop looking at them as a neighbor and start looking at them as a possible problem. Then came the twist I wasn't expecting. On the third day, I heard Daniel arguing with his contractor by the fence. Not yelling exactly, but sharp enough that every word carried. When they noticed me, Daniel called me over. The contractor looked like a man who'd already rehearsed excuses in the truck on the way over. Daniel held up the survey and said, tight as a wire. He checked it again. Your survey's right. Just like that, the denial was gone. The contractor admitted they'd built off the wrong reference. No conspiracy, no secret land grab, just a bad assumption wrapped in expensive materials. And weirdly enough, that made it more human and more dangerous at the same time. Because the ugliest messes in life usually don't begin with evil masterminds. They begin with people being careless on things they had no right to be careless about. Daniel rubbed his face and asked, so where does that leave us? I gave him the two obvious options: tear it down and rebuild it, or leave it there and live with a legal mess that would follow both of us for years. He hated both of those. Frankly, so did I. Then I gave him a third. You buy the strip. He blinked. The contractor stopped moving altogether. I said we could adjust the boundary, make the fence legal, file it properly with the county, settle it clean. Daniel just stood there, thinking sunlight catching on those stupid sunglasses. And for the first time since this started, I saw something different in him. Not arrogance, not defensiveness, relief. Over the next couple weeks, lawyers got involved. Drafts, revisions, measurements, compensation filings, all the glamorous stuff nobody ever puts in the movie version. My attorney told me I had leverage. Said I could force removal, push the price up, make an example out of him. And she wasn't wrong. Legally, I could have gone hard. But I kept thinking about something simple. I still had to live next to the guy. In the end, we made the deal. Daniel bought the narrow strip of land where the fence sat, plus a small buffer. The price was fair, maybe tilted a little my way, but not greedy. The county recorded the new line. The orange flags came down. The metal pins stayed where they'd always been buried, like old truth usually is. These days, if you drove by, you'd never know any of this happened. The fence looks perfect. Daniel finished his sleek magazine house. We nod when we see each other, talk weather once in a while, keep it cordial. Not friends, not enemies. Just two men who learned exactly how expensive an assumption can get. And every now and then I walk that line and think about how close I came to losing something just because it happened quietly. That's the part that stuck with me most. People think losing what's yours always comes with noise, courtrooms, screaming, flashing lights. Sometimes it doesn't. Sometimes it comes dressed up as improvement. Sometimes it shows up clean, professional, expensive, and almost convincing enough to make you doubt your own ground. That whole mess taught me something. I wish more people understood. Boundaries don't disappear all at once. They disappear a little at a time, every time somebody assumes, every time you stay quiet to keep the peace, every time convenience gets treated like permission. And the bitter truth is, a lot of folks will respect a line only after you prove you're willing to defend it. Still, there's another truth sitting right beside that one. Just because you can crush somebody doesn't always mean you should. I could have made Daniel tear every last stone out of the earth. I could have dragged him through court, made the whole thing uglier than it already was, and maybe part of me would have enjoyed that for about 10 minutes. But winning isn't always about destruction. Sometimes it's about forcing the truth into the open, then deciding what kind of man you want to be once you have the upper hand. So yeah, I protected what was mine. But I also sold a piece of it. Depends on how you look at it. Maybe that's justice, maybe that's compromise, maybe that's just adulthood being a lot less dramatic than revenge fantasies make it sound. What do you think, if you were in my shoes, would you have forced him to tear the whole fence down just to make the point crystal clear? Or would you have taken the money, moved the line, and ended the war without blowing up the neighborhood? And where do you think the real line is between standing up for yourself and taking advantage once you finally can? Drop your thoughts in the comments, and if you've ever had a neighbor push a boundary legal or otherwise, tell me how it ended. Because stories like this aren't really just about fences, are they?